do this afternoon is ask the question, is technology friend or foe as we care for those loved ones at the end of life? Now, this is a trick question. Very few people now, I've left CTU 4 years ago, very few of my students are still around, although I see some in the audience. People know that I give trick questions. This is a trick question. Of course, technology is a friend. None of us ever want to go back to where things were 50 years ago. But is it fully a friend is the real question. And what has technology done that changes the way we look at things that might not be always the most helpful? So now that you know it's a trick question, you can leave and you don't even have to listen to the rest of the talk. So why even speak about this? We're going to do it that way. Ultimately, wonderful, wonderful things have happened in the past decades regarding medicine, medical technology. Things we couldn't even imagine 50 years ago are now commonplace. But in the midst of that, all sorts of things have also changed. And a major way we deal with end-of-life issues today, in this country at least, is by means of high-tech rescue medicine, what many bioethicists are now calling last chance therapies. It has really saved the lives of lots of people. But what it's also done for many is really created havoc with the dying process. It's done wonderful things, but it's also done problematical things. And what I'm going to ask at least is there a way to deal with the problematical elements that technology has given us? And interestingly, how I would like to deal with it is go back 500 years. A few years ago there was a science fiction movie with Michael J. Fox, Back to the Future. Basically, that's what I want to do today. Let's go back 500 years to go to the future. So, I'm going to take this journey first forward, then backwards, and then forwards again. So I want to begin by a study that occurred over 15 years ago. The study was called the Support Study. Study to understand progress and preferences for outcomes and risks of treatment. And what it did was look at what's happening in end-of-life care in the United States, 1995. And what they discovered was that less than 47% of physicians knew when their patients preferred to avoid CPR. They actually wanted a DNR order, and the physicians didn't know it. That 46% of DNR orders were given 2 days before a patient died. That 38% spend the last 10 days of their lives in the intensive care unit, often on mechanical ventilation. ICU units are fantastic, but they're not the place to die. And finally, that over 50% of patients who were conscious to voice preferences said that they were dying in moderate to severe pain. They spent 3 years trying to change those outcomes. In 1998, did a second study. Nothing had changed. I want to suggest that had that study been done last year, very little would have changed again. Palliative care has done wonders, but in the same hospitals where palliative care is doing very well, those patients not on palliative care are suffering even more. We have a real mixed history regarding how we care for those at the end of life. With that in mind, what I would like us to do is ask, what do we do about severe sickness and even dying in this country? Again, why does this tend to happen? Because there's always something more to do. There's always another therapy that can be used to keep somebody alive, which simply means keeping their heart beating, not necessarily keeping them truly alive. Um, High-risk therapies, high-tech rescue medicine occurs when there's an imminent risk of death. These therapies are oftentimes very expensive. We don't want to use cost, but we have to. We have to speak about cost sometime. They are relatively frequently used, especially in ICU units, and the average gain in life expectancy is marginal. One of the most interesting things which has hurt us in this country has been television medical shows. When you see in ER or any of those a code being called, the nurses run in, the doctors run in, they have all of this high-tech medicine, they shock the patient, and what, 110% of the times the patient lives, right? In actuality, in a real hospital, especially if the patient is elderly, the patient leaves the hospital under their own power less than 5% of the time. Our image and reality are very different. And so what happens is, because of what is going on, oftentimes inhumane treatment is done either out of trying to keep the patient alive, or sometimes because of religious reasons, families believe that a miracle will happen. Attempts to provide better, more appropriate care tend to fail. Remember death panels of a couple years ago? And because of expectation, disappointment, the attempts at passing laws which allow for assisted dying, physician-assisted suicide, become more and more prevalent. This coming week, it will be voted in Massachusetts. It's going to be very interesting. 6 weeks ago, there were 67% of the population in favor of the law. It's now down to 47%. But those against the law are 41%. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in Massachusetts the day after tomorrow. So, what do? Why do we end up with this love-hate, I think, relationship to technology? The availability of technology, I believe, has radically altered our feelings and our thoughts about what medicine should do. The availability of technology has even changed the questions we ask at the end of life. Think of these. Whoops, I thought the thing went there. Should death be held off as long as possible? Should it be hastened? Previous generations never had to ask those sorts of questions. Does opting for quality of life go against the sanctity of life? Previous generations never had to choose one or the other. Does a patient have a moral right as well as a legal right to refuse treatment? Does a patient, or if they do, what criteria should underlie the decision to stop? Who should make these decisions? It's an interesting history of the last 30 years in medicine. My grandmother died in 1968. A few weeks before she died, she was going to be given an operation to amputate a leg of hers. My mother was told about it and discussed it. My aunt, my grandmother, who was absolutely 100% lucid, was never part of that decision. We've moved from physician making all the decisions to now patients making all the decisions, and maybe both of those are problematic. How do we bring the two together? And finally, is the decision to stop treatment the same as killing? And here we're going to go to our Catholic tradition, but this has become a real life question in 2012, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. So, in a book in 1992, 20 years ago, a philosopher by the name of Daniel Callahan, the founder of the Hastings Center which is the best bioethics think tank in this country, wrote a book called The Troubled Dream of Life. A fantastic book, a very thin book, a very short book, a very dense book, and a book I really suggest everybody read, The Troubled Dream of Life. And in that he talked about what he called technological monism. Now, if you leave here and go home and start talking about technological monism, everybody's going to see how erudite you've become just by attending one Sunday afternoon at CTU. What he meant by technological monism is that we today believe that the only way to deal with sickness is through some form of technology. Whether that technology is a pill or whether that technology is a bone marrow transplant, there's a technological answer for every medical problem. And we tend to believe that only technological answers are valid. All meaningful actions are technological, and therefore what nature does, its underlying pathologies, have nothing to do with death. Death does not come because of cancer. Death comes because the physician who could hold off death has stopped for one reason or another. And I'll bring this up in just one more minute. No natural cause is determinative unless we fail to deploy technology. He believes that technological monism leads to technological brinkmanship. The belief that a physician has that she or he can stop technology right at the last minute. We'll know when to stop. The difficulty is we don't know when to stop because there's always something more to be done. Daniel Callahan wrote this book 20 years ago. The issue has become even more important since. In the last year, two important bioethics books have come out in the secular realm, secular ethics. One has been by Franklin Miller and Robert Truog. Franklin Miller is ethicist for the National Institutes of Health, and Truog is a physician at Harvard Medical School. The book is called Death, Dying, and Organ Transplantation. And in it, Miller and Truog simply say, the last thing that happens before death causes death. If you shut off a machine and the person dies, the physician has caused the death of the patient. Simply, the last thing that occurs is the cause. Exactly what Callahan was yelling about. And what we should realize is not allowing to die and killing, both are killing. We should start talking about when is killing justified or not. And then they move into the second part of their book on organ transplantation, and that's one of the things that justifies the killing of a dying patient to procure her or his organs. A book that has been not accepted, but really seriously debated by the bioethics community. Almost at the exact same time, another book called The Anticipatory Corpse. How would you like to go onto an airplane and read the book, The Anticipatory Corpse, which I have? This written by a physician by the name of Jeffrey Bishop, who teaches at St. Louis University, takes to task Miller and Truog, and basically suggests that what we have done nowadays is believe that the only causality that makes sense is efficient causality. This goes back 300 years before Christ to Aristotle. And that what we need to realize are that there are many sorts of causes, efficient cause being only one of them. And perhaps the most important cause might be the final cause, the purposes for which life is there. And maybe we have to speak again in Aristotelian language about the purposes of life. 2 weeks ago, I was at the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities annual meeting. This became a real huge debate In fact, Miller and Bishop chaired one of the sessions and argued with each other for an hour and a half. It was delightful. It was really wonderful to listen to. But notice, a question which came up 20 years ago is still a very real question today. Technology has changed the way we see our duties to one another. Technology has changed the way we feel medicine ought to work. And it goes even a little bit more complicated. And it's Bishop that said, medicine today has joined together technology and autonomy. And sovereign choice, he claims, is not the way we ought to be going in medicine. And so autonomy has become very important in the United States today. Now, the one difficulty with autonomy, which is helpful, is that somehow we can raise that up almost to an idol. And autonomy has very specific meanings in law today, going back well over 100 years. Horace Gray, in 1891, basically said, no right is more sacred than the individual's possession and control of his or her own person, free from all restraint. Even earlier, Justice Cooley, basically said, autonomy is the right to be left alone. Even when I was teaching here at CTU, every other January, I would go to Zimbabwe to teach. They're always interested in what's happening in the United States. I had to give a talk on stem cell research in a country that has no technology. That's how interested they are in what's happening in the United States. But when I speak of autonomy with my students, their eyes get as big as saucers. What I call autonomy, they call abandonment. In Africa, the saying is, I am because we are. Decisions are made by the family in Zimbabwe. And the family is not mother, father, children family. It is aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins of cousins of cousins of cousins of cousins of cousins. Literally, there could be 40 people making a decision in which the sick person has one voice among 40, which I tend to think that as Americans a little nervous, to think that 40 people are going to be making my decision for me. Back to autonomy. Technology and autonomy, in many ways, have come together. And so, what happens? Many, again, non-Catholic philosophers are beginning to rethink what autonomy as technology has done in our understanding of medicine. Willard Galen, Bruce Jennings, two philosophers, psychologists from the Hastings Center, have suggested that autonomy gives individuals a moral liberation from authority. But they ask, will individuals so liberated still acknowledge their moral relationships? We are in it together, and technology can help us forget that. Similarly, Arthur Kaplan had been bioethicist at the University of Pennsylvania, has just moved this year to New York University, has suggested that the preeminence of autonomy reflects the fact that there is no broad consensus in our country about the good. We don't agree on what's good, so he says let everyone do what they want. I believe that our love of autonomy is part of a myth of control. Do we really believe we can control everything? And guess what? It ain't necessarily so. And so, how do we look at this? What do we do? What I want to suggest is that maybe the Catholic moral tradition has something to say to this particular issue that's occurring in our United States at this very moment. What's going on? Physicians often pursue aggressive treatment beyond reasonable hope for success because once they've begun, contrary to technological brinkmanship, they don't know when to stop. That the cycle, as I said, suggested earlier, raises our ability to accept things like physician-assisted suicide, and that perhaps we need to hear something we don't always like to hear, that maybe what is technologically possible is not always morally desirable. For autonomy, perhaps the Catholic tradition helps us balance autonomy, which is good, with care. How do we care for somebody? And again, my image, now I'll show you my age, Marcus Welby. Nobody here remembers Marcus Welby, right? Those of us with white hair do. For those of you who are under 100 years old, Marcus Welby was a physician. I think he was in the 60s. A half-hour program. Marcus Welby would make a house call. I know you people don't even know what house calls are, but would make a house call with a little black bag and not only fix the person's disease, but fix all the relationships in the family in a half hour. Do you remember that? Marcus Welby is the image of care, but the care of how I am going to do it, not respecting your autonomy. Care without autonomy is basically paternalism. Marcus Welby was also, before that, father knows best. But autonomy without care is abandonment, just like my students in Zimbabwe knew. We need both care and autonomy, at least in this country. There's always going to be a tension, however, and maybe what we need to do is learn to live with that tension. One of the ways I would like to suggest is to take a look at our Catholic tradition. 500 years old, but I think still very young. The Catholic tradition says that indeed there's a duty to preserve life because life is a sacred gift from God. But it always also says that this is a limited duty, not something we don't take seriously. But by taking it seriously, we also remember its limits. Since the 16th century, we have talked about this in terms of ordinary and extraordinary means. Wonderful idea, terrible terms. Sadly, most people think ordinary means ordinary medical care, and extraordinary means extraordinary medical care. That's not the case. Anything can be medically or morally extraordinary if it doesn't benefit the patient. Anything is extraordinary if it doesn't benefit the patient. How does that look? Pius XII basically said life, health, and all temporal activities are subordinate to other ends. Pope John Paul said it is precisely our supernatural calling that allows us the flexibility we need in dealing with end-of-life issues. How do we do this? We assess the burdens and the benefits to the individual. Without hope of benefit to the patient, without some proportion of burdens and benefits, a means cannot be ordinary or medically obligatory. Now, what does ordinary or benefit and burden means? Okay, ordinary, extraordinary. If it's extraordinary, it's not required. Extraordinary means it's burdensome without being beneficial. Well, what do we mean now by burdens and benefits? And again, being a good moral theologian, we go back to the past to talk to the future. And we look at St. Alphonsus Liguori, the father of moral theology, the patron saint of moral theology. Alphonsus basically gave 4 examples of burden. Notice, for him, great effort on the part of the patient. That makes something burdensome. If we live in Chicago and the only possible cure for whatever disease I might have is in Philadelphia, there's no obligation for me to move to Philadelphia to get that treatment. I might choose to, but I'm not obliged to. The second, enormous pain. That one is, I hope, a no-brainer, although there are some people who feel that somehow, to be good Catholics, we ought to have more and more pain. That's not the Catholic tradition. Extraordinary means or extraordinary expense. Alphonsus says, no one is obliged to spend an exorbitant amount of money to preserve one's life. And interestingly, when he was talking, he mentioned that one never has to buy meat to preserve one's life. In his day and age, you did not eat meat all that often. And the last one, which is my favorite, and I love the Latin, psychological repugnance. The Latin is vehemens horror, vehement horror. It's sometimes the case where we fear the treatment more than we fear death itself. One of our brothers, Franciscan brother, in Chicago, was deathly afraid ever of having to have kidney dialysis. In fact, prayed that he never would have kidney dialysis. He obviously was not, sadly, a good prayer because he ended up with kidney failure. And the provincial asked if he would try. This brother would not sleep the night before he had to go for dialysis. He would be sweating in the car on the way to dialysis. He would almost be shaking as he went into the dialysis room. And within 2 weeks, phoned our provincial begging him not to do that anymore. Could you picture what vehemens horror means in that situation? For this brother, death was preferable to 3 times a week going through that. He died. Nobody would say he committed suicide. The fear of the treatment was much worse than the possibility and acknowledgement that this would have to be done for the rest of his life. Those are what our tradition says we should think of when we deal with end-of-life issues. And that acknowledging that a treatment is burdensome is not the same as killing oneself. Benefits are a little problematic. And interestingly, no part of our tradition has ever defined what a benefit is. The benefit is decided by the patient herself or himself. Examples: ability to move can be beneficial. Remaining conscious can be beneficial. Being able to live 2 more weeks to see my granddaughter graduate from medical school might be beneficial. Benefits are determined by the patient herself, himself, by the family. Burdens are determined by the patient and the family. That has been our Catholic tradition. What the issue that has always been asked are the benefits of any treatment proportionate to the burdens endured? If the answer is yes by the patient, we do it. If the answer is no, we don't. We don't necessarily, we might try to argue the patient out, but the patient in our Catholic tradition, for 400 years, has the final say. What is interesting, this is just simply saying the same thing. What is interesting is that I think because of the fear of euthanasia, in recent years in the Catholic tradition itself, there's been an attempt to narrow what benefits and burdens might mean, and to try to make them more objective, because this now looks too subjective if we're going to let the patient decide. And how this has begun has been with a talk which Pope John Paul II gave in 2004 on the persistent vegetative state. We'll say a little bit about that. But what has happened in its aftermath has been a change, a subtle change in language. And we moral theologians, it's almost like people listening to the president or Romney to find the subtle changes in what they're saying. We're always listening to what's being said, especially in the Vatican, and trying to find subtle changes. What has happened is the language oftentimes that has been begun now in the past several years has been talking about the procedures rather than benefits and burdens to the patient. And the person who has done this most has been an Italian physician and also a philosopher here in this country by the name of John Haas, who's the president of the National Catholic Bioethics Center. And what he has suggested is that we are moving from subjective understandings to more objective understandings. In 1980, the Vatican tried to change the language of ordinary, extraordinary means to proportionate and disproportionate. Nobody understood ordinary, extraordinary. As I said before, it sounded much more like medical treatments than burdens and benefits. So the Vatican tried to change the language and started using the language proportionate and disproportionate. That never worked. Everybody has gone back to ordinary, extraordinary. But what some theologians have done is suggest that ordinary, extraordinary is the subjective, which is what our tradition said, but proportionate, disproportionate is much more objective, and it is the medical treatment, not the burden to the patient. And so they've begun talking about something called therapeutic proportionality and emphasized that it's not a subjective judgment on the part of the patient, but on the over well-being of the patient as judged by the physician. And so that suddenly we're moving from a more subjective, problematic interpretation to a more objective, scientific, medical understanding. Such a decision, they claim, would need no concurrence on the part of the patient. The fear of autonomy sort of moving to the opposite extreme. They call it a continual refinement of terms to allow greater precision in ethical judgment. I'm of the group that believes that this movement is terrifying, and that rather than being something that clarifies, it's a simplification that might ultimately hurt people. And therefore, let's look at the 2004 statement of Pope John Paul, which supposedly all of this goes back to. In 2004, the Pope gave an allocution. You and I give talks, popes give allocutions. And the allocution was on the persistent vegetative state. Now that's a very particular medical condition in which the person is alive but unaware. He was not talking about dying patients. A person in a persistent vegetative state is not necessarily dying. One has lived for 39 years, 111 days, and it's hard to say, unless you're maybe a Heideggerian, that you're dying for that 39 years. So what the Pope said is we've got to respect the dignity of patients in persistent vegetative states. And in that, Section 4 became the part that sort of had an awful lot of doctor friends of mine pulling out their hair. Mine came naturally, but my friends started pulling out of their hair trying to understand this. I should like to underline how the administration of water and food by artificial means always represents a natural means of preserving life. My doctor friends said, huh? What the Pope was ultimately trying to do, I think, is restate the tradition, but in a way that maybe caused a bit more complications than it needed. He began using nature in the way nature was used in 1500s. So he made two talks, two distinctions, natural and artificial, and ordinary, extraordinary. Nature, for the Pope, does not mean found in nature. But what he did was go back to the 16th century understanding, and that is, what is the nature of medicine? What is the nature of food? What is the purpose that all of this has. And basically he said the nature of food is to give sustenance. And as long as food is accomplishing its nature, however it's given, naturally or artificially, as long as it's accomplishing its nature, it should be given. The nature of food is to give sustenance. If it's giving sustenance to a person in persistent vegetative state, it's doing what it should be doing. Therefore, it's natural, even though the means employed are artificial. Does that make sense? No? Okay. The nature of food is to give sustenance. However we do it, if it gives sustenance, it's fulfilling its purpose. Does that make sense? In the 16th century, nature and purpose meant the exact same thing. Not anymore. So he's going back to an old definition. Does that make sense? Thank you. As long as it's doing what it's meant to do, we should continue it. But at the end of life, food no longer gives sustenance. The body begins shutting down. Food is no longer able to accomplish what it's supposed to do. And therefore, it is not fulfilling its purpose. It's now morally optional. And the 5th edition of the Ethical and Religious Directives say that. The difficulty is it comes in the 3rd sentence. And people don't always read to the 3rd sentence in any of these things. Notice the 3rd sentence, medically assisted nutrition becomes morally optional when it cannot reasonably be expected to prolong life, or it becomes burdensome. Back to benefit, burden. Back to the tradition. The difficulty is that so many people are so frightened of medically assisted suicide that we're becoming what's oftentimes called vitalist. We're going to do everything we can to keep a patient's body going. Back to technological monism, back to technological brinkmanship. So, what I would like to suggest is the narrowing of the tradition, while being done for good reasons out of fear of euthanasia, is really not helping. In fact, it's making people even more frightened of having to deal with end-of-life issues and make end-of-life decisions. And it is not the Catholic tradition. I work with Catholic hospitals across the country. And what oftentimes the impression that is being given by some people, both strongly pro-life and strongly pro-euthanasia, is that if you go to a Catholic hospital, no matter what the reason, you will get a feeding tube. Sometimes I get the impression that if you go to visit a patient, you're going to get a feeding tube before you get out of the hospital. That is not the Catholic tradition. That is not what happens in Catholic hospitals. But it's amazing how many people are afraid that that's what's going to happen. That's not our tradition. What is our tradition? Our tradition is a wisdom tradition. Our tradition is a tradition that virtue is always in the middle, that there are two extremes, and that both extremes are vice. Euthanasia on the one hand, but simply doing everything we can to keep a heart beating for hours or days on the other is also a vice. What is our Catholic tradition? Now, as a Franciscan, this is hard for me to say, but it comes from Thomas Aquinas. What does the tradition say? That we need prudence in making our moral decisions. That's part of who we are. We are a people who value the virtue of prudence. Virtue is a middle position always. Aristotle and Thomas would always say, virtus in medio stat. Virtue stands in the middle. By doing that, our tradition, especially at the end of life, is always going to acknowledge ambiguity. We are going to oftentimes disagree on when the time has come to say enough is enough. And we might argue about that, but we have to acknowledge that being in the middle, it's not as neat as going to one side or the other. Those decisions are going to be messy. When I was a faculty member here, I wrote an article for Catholic for Health Progress, the journal of the Catholic Health Association that I'm now part of. And I kept talking about the end-of-life decisions we make are always messy ones. And I received an answer from the Catholic Health Association that they wanted to publish the article, but messy was not sophisticated enough a word. So they changed it to ambiguous. And I always told all my friends, every time you read the article, to cross out ambiguous and write messy. They're messy. There's no way we're going to get rid of that, but that doesn't mean we can't make those decisions. We can and need to make the decisions for ourselves, for our loved ones, allowing this wonderful tradition of ours of ordinary, extraordinary means. And finally, just to, through Latin, and I thought I should throw a little Greek in this last time as well, Thomas Aquinas spoke about phronesis. Phronesis is a Greek term that means moral wisdom. We need to be morally wise people. And what does moral wisdom entail? It is being committed to our loved ones, being committed to our Catholic tradition, but knowing that that tradition acknowledges ambiguity, acknowledges the importance of prudence, and acknowledges that as we make the decisions, we also have the benefit of other people and the benefit of a 400-year-old tradition, which I think is as relevant today as it was in the times of Alphonsus Liguori. So, is technology a friend or a foe? It's definitely a friend, but sometimes it's a fair weather friend. And what we need to do as good Catholics, as good American citizens, as people who always are going to face death one way or another, ourselves or with our families, is have the conviction of our faith and also the knowledge of medicine, at least enough that we can feel comfortable making decisions which are not always going to be easy, are often going to be painful, but are still always possible. Thanks very much.